Look at the continuation of the argument that I've been making so far, and I'm going to pay special attention to some aspects of Christianity, various forms of Christianity. In many ways, perhaps it's worth saying something about the origins of Judaism and the kind of religion that was found just before the time of Jesus. It seems fairly clear that the religion, the religion and the political system together developed in sort of dinky-toy imitation of the great Babylonian states. The Jews attempted to, were clearly using that model, which of course unifies totally the state and the religious. And of course, with the collapse of the Jewish state in the Babylonian exile, they were left with what was left of that combination, which is something one might call a religion, a monotheistic religion, since of course it was modeled on the state with its unique head. Once you get this phenomena called religion, which, as I've been stressing right from the first, cannot be used as an analytical category, but should be seen as a particular phenomena that occurs in particular circumstances at particular time. It shouldn't be considered as an aspect of human beings, as it is so often done, for the reasons that I've explained. Once you get religion, it's quite clear that states are attracted. It means that it then becomes something that can be picked up by states from which it doesn't originate. And of course, the attraction to states of picking up religions is quite obvious, because states are trying to become transcendental entities. By that I mean entities which exist beyond the transformation which characterizes all organic beings. They want to appear to have an existence through time, to last, irrespective of personnel, irrespective of changes, and so on. And of course, they do that in much the same way as the Malagasy villages who I was talking about, by using and recruiting our powers of imagination, anchoring them, making them almost making them material through ritual and through material props, palaces, royal paraphernalia, and so on. They're trying to go beyond the transformational, the transactional, so that they have that imaginary permanence. They can only be imaginary because, as I was been stressing throughout, we are not permanent. We are in a state of flux, so imaginary entities can only be in that way. And of course, religions on the loose seem to offer this. They offer also a kind of transcendental anchoring to the kinds of things states want to make transcendental. Law by definition, being transcendental because it is a system which is not changing from case to case, and therefore has to come from somewhere above. I would argue that it's similar with the idea, with the kind of monopoly of healing, which is based on permanent principles. And of course the idea, the corporate imagery, the idea that the state is one person in the way that the Spaniards and the Italians could have imagined themselves for a very short time as one person during a football match. But notice the very, very short time, which of course is exactly the same problem with states anyway. But they can only be transcendental for short periods. The attraction of and of course, the moments, of course, when they're likely to pick up other religions is when they're in a bad way, when they're in trouble, when therefore they can't really rely on their own constructions. It's no accident that the Roman Empire picked up Christianity when it was in a state of complete collapse, when almost everything had become illegitimated in its various areas. The attraction of religion to subjects of states at times of trouble, at times when the state seems to be breaking up, which of course is doing most of the time. It's very rare that it's not in a state of collapse. The Greeks will be, might be cheered up by that. They shouldn't worry. That's the normal state of affairs for a state. Then the attraction of religion is clear in that it's the promise of the holistic, hierarchical healing element which they can integrate in through kneeling. Remember what I was saying last week about deference being an essential, bodily deference as well as intellectual deference being an essential element of religious systems. We can sort of try to get, because of course healing is something I haven't talked about enough, and I really should stress it. If you remember when I was talking about the Malagasy village, one of the things which is very, very striking about rituals, which it seems to me is not underlined enough about in the literature, is that they're above all big meals, big, immense meals when you invite large numbers of people who eat together. And in the very particular system of the Malagasy that I was talking about, it's as though a particular holy house and its descendants were being recreated together as though they were only one house with one hearth, ignoring the fact that the descendants have gone away, that they've married foreigners because of the rule of incest. So in a sense, an illusion of a unity which doesn't exist is created by the eating together of the meal. And because that unites you with the ancestors, it is healing, because in the end the rituals are always carried out for reasons of overcoming disease in the very wide sense, which includes what we would think of as medical diseases, but quarrels within disputes, bad crops and everything else, any sort of misfortune, which are all seen as part of that totality of disease. So this regrouping in an imaginary one family where the dispersal is being forgotten is an essential aspect. And of course, this is the attraction for subjects. Though of course most people are converted by force, we should not forget, to the world religions. There's some of them do convert by choice, or half force, I should say. So the situation I've been talking about so far is I've reached the point of where religion and the state have become separate and are trying to put themselves together again. What I'll be arguing in this lecture is that this creates a kind of endless chase between the two, which is that they try to merge into the kind of totality which I talked about at first, but it never seems to work. And I think I will be arguing that the reason why it doesn't work is because the state and the religion separated are not as different as they would like to be, and therefore are competing continually. If you think of the history of Europe, over law, competing over medicine actually, over the processes of healing, and in all sorts of ways. In fact, I shall be arguing that it's impossible to put Humpty Dumpty together again once the thing has been broken. But before doing that, it's worth having a look at a few examples which seem to, which are successes of putting things together again, because it's interesting to see what elements made that possible, though I think there are other exceptions that prove the rule. One of the examples I found particularly fascinating is that described by the Norwegian anthropologist, I can never say his blooming name, Viding, V-I-D-I-N-G, I don't know how you pronounce that in Norwegian, about Malaita, a particular area of the Solomon Islands, where a kind of state has arisen which seems extraordinarily successful. It's a developer's dream. Now, how that came about is particularly interesting. Fairly ordinary kind of events got going at one stage. The people of Malaita were converted to Methodist Church, and I think there's something very interesting about the Methodist Church, in that, like the London Missionary Society, who I'll talk about, which emerged from the Congregationalist Church in England, these are politically weak churches. They're not closely allied with any of the colonial powers. And therefore, they had to make all sorts of compromises in relationship to local power, which the Catholics, the Anglicans didn't have to do in other places. This is one key element to that. And what happened in Malaita is that one of their ministers, I think a minister, started his own breakaway Methodist system. This happens again all over the place, and created a new version of what was a sort of synthetic putting together of Methodism and ancestor worship. And also, this particular leader, was in a pivotal position in the social system in the genealogical system, so that she was able to combine kinship, we could say, sort of simply kinship politics and religion together. However, the creation of what one might call the Malaites state, and that is how Hivding describes it, came to the full as a success when the Solomon Island government completely collapsed. For a number of years, there was no government in the Solomon Islands. In the end, that situation was ended by the Australian army coming in. But they managed to sort of close themselves off, and also to centralize a great amount of resources. They started this church-stroke state, exported large amounts of timber, valuable timber, interestingly to Chinese companies, which were therefore therefore the whole relationship was out of the control of either the Solomon Islands state or the sort of semi-colonial powers around. It obtained a lot of money and used this money in a way which is very untypical of many states, that is, let us say, for the good of the people. For a remarkable education system, medical system, it imported all this from around, but these were subjects brought in, and the thing sort of worked very well under this original prophet, calling himself the Holy Mama. Mama being a word for father, by the way, in that place, strongly disapproved of by outsiders. Of course, once it began to get successful, the disapproval became very much weaker, and his successor, the Holy Mama, the present Holy Mama, was invited by Queen Elizabeth II to a grand ceremony in London where he was knighted. I'm simplifying the situation, but that is a rare example. Please note all the exceptional features, the collapse of any other state, the fact that it's relatively small scale, the reach, the tremendous amount of money, and the inability of the predatory powers around to much affect what was going on. You get a rather similar situation on a larger scale and less successful in Botswana, where the hereditary ruler, basically, of one of the kingdoms of Botswana, but he managed to establish himself over the others, Seretse Khama, became an anti-colonial nationalist leader, allied himself again with the Methodist Church, which he transformed and merged with ancestor worship, and also had tremendous monetary resources thanks to diamond mining, which he was able to control for the state. So that looked for a while as though this was successful, but since it's based on descent, this system, it actually excluded large numbers of people, excluded large numbers of non-Tswana, and is running into trouble now to a certain extent. In Madagascar, the London Missionary Society attempted a kind of alliance with the Mariner, who I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, which more or less worked, where again we have rather similar elements. The most important one was the weakness of the London Missionary Society, not backed by either France or Britain, their congregationalists. And that's rather important, which meant that they were able to, that they were very willing to compromise. But actually the thing didn't last long, probably because the colonial situation, the pressure of the colonial powers was much greater than it could become in the late 20th century, either for Malaita or Botswana, and also because it didn't have its massive riches. So, all right, it's just about possible to do it. But I think it's extremely rare. It seems to only work on Malaita for quite a while, but it's a very small place. I suspect it may well last, but of course it depends how much they can keep other outsiders from interfering with them. But in a sense, it's quite intriguing that this kind of situation is exactly what people who are into development sort of go on about, telling you that they're aiming for, which of course they never get anywhere near and absolutely useless, in the sense that nearly all development projects are useless, but there they are, very, very good medical system, education for all, a degree of medical, nutritional and wealth and so on, occurring in a very odd way. But I'm really going to go and look at the difficulties of achieving this kind of combination. And for that, I'm going to try to argue that the difficulty is absolutely fundamental. I'll be looking at relatively new Christian movements, like certain Pentecostalist movements and the Mormons. And the reason why I choose them is because in the literature, in the anthropological literature, what is continually being stressed about these movements is their link with globalization, because indeed they're highly globalized. They're on the internet continually. They're very, very good with all forms of new media. They seem to come from places like the United States or Nigeria and spread around. And also the idea that they're particular and modernity, because they are very good at using what we think of as the trappings of modernity. But I really believe that, personally think that these things are extremely superficial. And in a way, trying to show you that, I try to show that the kind of difficulties which have occurred subsequently in the history of Christianity were already to be found at the very beginning of Christianity. The sort of three models, three attempts at integration between religion and a polity, a state, are sort of hinted at the three different lines which are possible, and all run into trouble and continue to run into trouble. So I'll be turning to the little one knows about very early Christianity. Of course, then it wasn't Christianity, it was thought of as a particular version of Judaism, which we know a bit about from the epistles of St. Paul and the Acts of the Apostles. These three models, I think, can be sort of given names, and I shall give them names. One I will call the privatization model, which seems to have been advocated by the author of, hopefully, by the author of the Acts of the Apostles, who probably, none of this is certain, probably was probably the only non-Jewish author of the New Testament. But again, this is not at all sure. But what he seems to have been advocating is a kind of compromise, which of course all weak religious systems would want to have with powerful states, which would be that the Jewish Christians could get on with their religious business locally, and it wouldn't bother the Romans. The Romans could just do their, they could have their empire, and they would let them go on in a little private space. One of the things that's interesting, of course, about this is that in a sense it seems very similar to what is being attempted in the modern with modern states, with the idea, that a kind of compromise has been reached between a state which is secular, in inverted commas, and religion, which is a private matter, and the two therefore don't need to clash. I'm extremely suspicious of this, for the reasons that I've already given, that the state cannot be secular because of its transcendental claims, as we see very much with law. It's no again and again and again. Now, I'm not going to follow the compromise. I'm not going to look at the modern situation of modern nation states, just too much to talk about. Nor am I going to go through the attempts at some sort of compromise historically. But anybody who knows the history of Europe will know that it's a continual fight between the religious trying to become political and the political trying to become religious. The fights between kings and popes, whether it takes place, like in France, where sort of having your own private pope, because the one in Rome is too annoying, so you have it you have him in Avignon, or the Holy Roman Emperor wanting to be holy and Roman, while the Pope also wants to be Holy Roman Emperor, and so on and so on. I mean, it just never stops. Perhaps the most amusing episodes is the fights over Henry VIII of England's marital troubles, but that's the same story again and again. The murder of Thomas of Becket and so on are all illustrations of the inability of religion and the state to get together. An inability which I argue comes from the fact that they are much, much more similar things than they pretend to be. Much, much more similar. And that the idea that religion, you see, and I've grouped them together under the transcendental because they both make claims very, very similar transcendentals. So I want to look at the other two models, especially, which you already find in this very early Christianity, because these other two models are very interesting because they themselves become threats to the modern state, to the modern nation state, with its presentation as a kind of privatization model. And they are continually, as recent history shows, a threat. And in a sense, these two are well described, well, they're not well described, but we see them appearing in the Acts of the Apostles, one of the most fascinating books I find of the Bible, and particularly concretized in what is often called the Jerusalem Council, the key element of the Acts of the Apostles. The Jerusalem Council seemed to have been a meeting of the two major tendencies of the followers of Jesus, and two very, very different lots of people. One of them is often described as the family of Jesus, because it's focused around Jesus' brother, James, the Apostle James, who seem to have been thinking in terms of taking the succession of Jesus and interpreting Jesus as rather like an Old Testament prophet, revivifying, renewing, but continuing the kind of image of the Jews of that time as one great, organic, hierarchical family, linked with a kinship system, if you like, rather like the Malagasy village that I was talking about, but writ large. And of course, the fact that he was the brother of Jesus is a perfect justification for him being the successor to Jesus. Interestingly, him and his group are the only group of the people who actually knew Jesus, as far as one can know, because they had lived with him, they spoke the same language, they remembered him, and if the Gospels, which are thought to come from that group, arrived, they were able to cite him continually. The other group of people are led by St. Paul. And St. Paul couldn't be more of a total contrast to this. And his view of what Jesus is like is completely different. Because, of course, he didn't know anything about Jesus. I mean, he just has a vision, which has almost no content. You must have heard of the name anyway, but otherwise you wouldn't have a vision. But as he says, he didn't know Jesus, he didn't speak the same language, he was a Hellenized Jew, he only cites a quotation from Jesus only once in the whole of his epistles, which is really rather strange if you think about it, since he's the main actor in the creation of the Christian Church. And you've met, I think, has been contested by some theologians that this is but on the other hand, he has his vision. Actually, Paul, quite honestly, has also the compromise vision, but he has also a vision that he is preparing for the second coming of Jesus, which he thinks is going to occur during his lifetime. And so the kind of social relations of the Pauline Christianity is very different from the hierarchical descent-based model of James. It's, God and then the human beings undifferentiated. You have this massive hierarchical difference between God and human beings. But human beings, since they're so far from God, are all the same. Neither Gentile nor Jew, neither man nor woman. They're all the same, sort of seen, if you like, from the perspective of God. You can understand the difference between fathers and mothers, And he's very strongly anti-kinship. He's anti-kinship, he's anti-ethnic affiliation, he's anti-gender. He's actually also anti-sex, because sex is about reproduction. And since he's expecting the end of the world, you don't want to sort of, there is no point in having reproduction, it just muddles things up. Well, you know, if you've got, while the James version is father, son, you know, linked within a kinship model. That's why I call that one the descent model. The other one, I'll call it the Pentecostalist model, to link it up with later versions. We'll get it from there. And of course, these two get together, and it's no doubt that they had a very violent arguments, because it couldn't be more different. And it's very interesting what they have the argument over. It's over circumcision. Because Paul, the reason why I find it so interesting is because circumcision is something which is so prominent in Madagascar, and one can understand what it's about. It's about taking kids away from their mothers to put them in a larger transcendental family through violence. That's basically. So it's about the constructing of a hierarchical descent-like system. And so no surprise, James wants to, once the Gentile, how they say, the Gentile follows with Jesus to be circumcised, Paul says it doesn't matter. Why should one bother, the second coming is coming, Anyway, he's against kinship, he's against placing them in that kind of pyramidal hierarchy. In the end, a kind of compromise arises that where they say, well, for the non-Jewish Christians, they don't need to be compromised, but they should follow the dietary laws, which is, a bit on the descent model. Later on, this is to cause tremendous problems, as indeed it has caused tremendous problems for many Christian churches subsequently. I don't know if somebody knows well the Seventh-day Adventists who have great difficulty about whether, definitely following the dietary laws, but some of them are not quite sure whether they should be circumcised or not. Similar with Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. And lots of other groups have this sort of thing. But it's interesting if one looks at those groups which take one or other of those two models, the two sides, if you like, which fight it out in the Jerusalem Council. And I'll take as an example the Pentecostalists as the example of the people along the kind of Pauline vision and their problems with the state. There have been endless waves of Pentecostalists probably throughout I'm using the word loosely and generally, throughout the history of Christianity, but they are particularly important at the moment in many parts of the world. Therefore, probably always been important in many parts of the world. The reason why I've picked up the Mormons and the Pentecostalists, of course, because they are the most active and successful Christian groups in the modern world. That is where Christianity is growing. It's not the Anglicans and the Catholics. Those are the groups which are growing. And it's interesting, and also I want to pay particular attention to those Pentecostalists which advocate what has been called the prosperity gospels, which been studied partly by Simon Coleman, whose work I follow, it's interesting to sort of think of the features that they have, that are stressed with them. And I think what one can characterize as their view is that they live in a corrupt world, and they're looking forward to the second coming, quite literally, we say that often, the end of the world. The world, and there are various ways of moving towards that second coming. One of them is, of course, cleaning the world so that one reaches a purely clean moment of the second coming. Hence the extreme focus on in Africa on the eradication of witches. No better symbol of cleaning than removing the witches from all around us, and the presence of the devil. The devil being the explanation of why the second coming hasn't quite come yet. Therefore, this endless preaching against the devil, very well described by the anthropologist Birgit Meyer, who probably you know, since she's one of your compatriots, who's worked a lot on that. Another very interesting feature of the Pentecostalists, which of course you find with the apostles from Pentecost, the moment which really gives them, is the speaking in tongues. And that's another of the ways in which the second coming was brought, because in the congregation and in the joint religious activity of the Pentecostalists, moments come when people abandon their own tongue to speak the tongue of the future period of that, looking forward to a future period when a new world, another language, therefore, you hardly get a stronger sign of abandonment of the present than giving up on the language. So they're little peeps into the future when another language will occur. Now, and also, of course, and this is really an interesting thing, is that they are above all healing cults. You join them, you go to Pentecostalists to be cured, because you're looking forward to the kind of regrouping that I was talking about among the Zafimanieri, among the people in Madagascar, when the regrouping but in the future is envisaged. Now, it's quite obvious why states don't like these manifestations, and it actually manifested when states are in a state of near collapse, which, as I say, is pretty common, is because they're just ignoring, they're just leaving behind the present state. By the way, one thing I didn't say is something which appears very shocking, I think, to Protestants brought up, well, probably Catholics as well, in the Weberian Protestant ethic, is that they stress very much the importance of earthly success and being prosperous, including money. Why not? Because in a sense, it's an advanced configuration of what it will be like wherever, when the second coming will be, and refusing to be in business to try to become rich is refusing moving forward towards that period of the second coming. So there's a kind of earthly element, but it's actually seen in a rather unearthly way. It's very much the idea, and that's often they use these words, of making themselves whole. So in other words, but I think what they mean is being totally prosperous in that and going towards that thing in the future. The history of political troubles with movements like that is common. And of course they're exactly the same. And this is why I'm sort of so suspicious of talking about modernity or globalization. Except we've always been globalized, and it's an illusion to think it's a particularly modern phenomenon. But it's very similar to the kind of events that I was talking to you about in Madagascar in the 19th century, when people became possessed and brought the burdens of the dead queen. So we're getting almost the same kind of idea there. And the other model is what I've called the descent model, that of James, if you like, in the Council of Jerusalem, which seems to be extraordinarily well exemplified by the Mormon Church. Also a church which is expanding tremendously in the modern world, and a member of which church may well become the next president of the United States. So we're not dealing with peripheral phenomena. Now, anyway, as I should have mentioned, in Madagascar, the Pentecostalists have very significantly, it's the latest version of these prosperity gospel people, call themselves winners. There's the winners' church, and there's the success church, which fits in with the kind of ideology that I was talking about. Now, the origin of the Mormons goes back to the 19th century, I think, and for the Mormons I'm following a little bit of partly the work of my colleague Fenella Canal, but also I'm using other work from other places. And they seem to be almost the opposite of the Pentecostalists, in the same way as James was the opposite to Paul. James and Peter, by the way, I should say, is an important element in that. And in a sense, they start off with a problem that many American Protestants had in the 19th century, who, like nearly everybody at that time, believed in the literal truth of the Bible written by an omniscient God. They had two problems. One of the problems was that there's no mention of America in the Bible. So it's a bit odd that the omniscient God just forgot about that. And but it's not just I'm being stupid in putting it like that. It's a problem of where to place yourself within God's world when you are in a non-mentioned place, which actually is very much worrying. And of course, the Mormons solved this problem beautifully by finding another gospel on American soil in Ohio, the Book of Mormon, which therefore, a lot of the Book of Mormon is about incorporating America within the cosmology of the Bible. And also, they also have a problem of trying to find out what kind of people they were and linking themselves to the chosen people, a problem which many Christians have had as a result. They're sort of literal believers of the Bible. In sort of a well-known problem in Christian theology, sort of the English at one stage decided, the English, but also lots of other people decided that the lost tribes of Israel had somehow turned up in rowing boats, no doubt, to England. You had this sort of idea all over the place. But the Mormons solved that problem and are solving it in the most spectacular way by establishing a universal genealogy going back to Abraham. So their job, if you like, as is well known, is trying to build up the genealogy of everybody you can possibly get hold of. They go around recording genealogies in Salt Lake City, their university in Utah. They have by far the largest genealogical data bank, and they're carrying on, you see, in the hope to have finally the genealogy of mankind, which will include this kind of so that it's sort of the dream of the descent model in an extreme way, that you just try to put everybody as father, son, husband, wife to everybody else in an immense hierarchical structure. Hierarchical in the sense that I've been using it so far in those lectures, where everybody will find their place. Interestingly enough, there's something so much in those terms that for a very long time the Mormons would call the non-Mormons Gentiles, having borrowed this kind of idea. But it's kind of ambiguity, because in the end all the Gentiles will be other Christian denominations like the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, are also into building genealogies, but rather less systematically. The whole point of always going back to Abraham in different kinds of ways. But of course, the contrast, so one has the contrast, in the place of kinship in those two models, absolutely, but one has it in all sorts of other ways. What the Mormons were trying to do from the first was to build a state localized in a particular place, with great temples, great massive temples on earth, going up to a massive temple in Utah. But they started off, it didn't start in, very significantly, it didn't start in Utah, but they started in Ohio and other parts of the East Coast, where they began to build themselves a kind of genealogy and local state, where with their laws, And of course, the same conflict comes with the state. Because, I mean, in the end, a large number of them were killed because they were attacked by the American civil guards. Because, of course, the state cannot tolerate a competitor in the transcendental, especially in the laws. And in the end, in a great heroic way, they trekked across. They thought they'd found a place where the American state was not going to bother them in Utah, but then bad luck. The American state followed them, and they reached some sort of compromise. But the most interesting, actually, where the compromise was, is over law. I mean, it's extraordinary that one of the most important elements of American state building should be about polygamy. The Mormons believed in polygamy was a good idea, and the compromise was that they weren't going to, that they were going to accept American laws on marriage and reproductive systems, of course. They weren't going to recognize the rightness of these laws, but they were going to enforce them. So the whole discussion is around laws which really sort of show that the state may look like a secular business, but it's not at all. And the kind of compromise that would be reached was over this. But they have succeeded in building a quasi-state, a local, which of course is acceptable. So in a sense, both these Pentecostalists in caricature form and the Mormons are choosing the two alternatives which you find in the Acts of the Apostles. And both of them turn out to be incompatible with the state. And the reason why they're incompatible with the state, I've been arguing, is because actually the state is just as much as a transcendental phenomenon. And in a sense, that's what the argument that I've been trying to follow throughout these lectures, by saying, that we're misled when we think that we can study a religion as though it was a given feature of human beings. What we have is this much more fundamental phenomena that I've called the transcendental, which is an essential element of the building of human societies, which takes obviously very specific forms around the world, but very, very often is linked to kinship and ancestors, because the two things go together. But then, with the development of states, of which there's lots to be said, we begin first of all the taking over of this for the state as we sort of see in Egypt or in the American state, which leads actually to the beginning of a bipolarization within that totality. And then you get the separation when the state collapses underneath one half, which becomes religion. But but in fact, they're still the same thing, and we're getting the kind of situations that we described.